Joining me on the way forward is DeJeune Green. She is a mental training specialist, and I had the pleasure of meeting DeJeune at New Orleans Entrepreneur Week. She was involved in a panel discussion. It was a fascinating discussion about having a healthy workplace as far as mental health is concerned. But I had a conversation with her and found out that DeJeune has a pretty expanded portfolio when we talk about mental health, and I became really interested in her views on trauma. And the reason is a lot of us go through a lot of trauma. And I really wanted to get her thoughts about what it's like for someone to have to bounce back from some sort of traumatic event. So, Dejanay, welcome to the Way Forward. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for having me today.
So I wanted to start with a basic definition because I think a lot of folks, we might say the word trauma a lot, but we may not necessarily know what we're talking about, present company included. So when just so that people understand, when you talk about trauma, what exactly constitutes trauma in someone's life?
Okay. So I have two definitions because trauma could be a few different things. According to SAMHSA describes individual trauma as an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, and or life-threatening harm. That event or circumstance can have lasting effects on an individual's mental health, physical health, emotional health, social well being, a few aspects of life. Another definition, the APA says that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident or crime or a natural disaster or abuse, neglect, things like that. And so trauma can be both the experience itself, but also the response to that experience.
So with that being said, it seems like a lot of times people may experience a traumatic event and they may see it as minor and they may react in a certain way and not even realize that they are actually reacting in a way that tells you that they went through some sort of trauma, correct?
Yes, sometimes people may self-medicate or they may, have different patterns in relationships to where that's their normal, but that's actually more like a trauma response. And it may not even be until they're aware that, oh, I have this pattern and this pattern seems to not be working well for relationships or
Mhm.
my well-being. That's when a conversation, can come in about, is this a response to trauma?
Are there types of trauma that people may not have any idea whatsoever they're experiencing at the time it's happening?
Very good question. I had to really think about this one because one thing that came to mind was grief. We say that grief tends to be the loss of a person, right? Grief is loss of a loved one, someone close to us. But grief can also be loss of a job, loss of a relationship, loss of an experience, loss of a pet. Grief could be loss. And sometimes that loss can have a traumatic impact on someone. So when people may think that, oh, I'm grieving the loss of my job or I'm grieving the loss of my pet, and those responses to that grief may not feel like grief. It feels like something else, but people tend to go straight to loss, grief, when that loss could be a traumatic event for that person. And the responses may be trauma responses interacting with grief. So that is something to consider. If there is a loss that, causes a great change or shift in a daily lifestyle or, personal well being, is it grief interacting with trauma? Is it just grief? Is it trauma? Is it a little bit of both? So I think that may be one area of mental health and mental well being that needs a little bit more focus, instead of just telling someone, oh, you're grieving the loss of this. Let's approach this as, grief counseling, or, you're going through this grieving process. It may be, hey, you experienced a traumatic event, or you're responding in a way that's bringing about traumatic responses. So let's address this as a traumatic experience interacting with grief.
So I'm gonna use myself as an example here, because I'm very open about this. That I get mental health therapy right now. I have a treatment plan that I'm going over with my therapist, and one of the things that we talked about when I started, ooh, it was just over a year ago. So one of the things that we talked about was we dug into the experiences I had in the workplace. And I'm one of those people who had experienced quite a bit of bullying in the workplace. I had some bosses who were brutal. I had some who said some things. I had some who did some things. And my response to that was pretty harsh a lot of times. I told someone that at one point my routine going home was to go home, have a drink, have something to eat, have another drink, kind of sit around, and then go to sleep. And one of the things that I told a leader once in a workplace was, hey, you have to be really careful with a lot of the people around here, because there are a lot of people here who have experienced workplace trauma. And I think, and I often wonder how common it is for people to experience workplace trauma and not even realize that that's what they're going through, especially if they've had abusive bosses. And they may not realize that just because someone doesn't cuss you out, that doesn't mean you're not being abused. And so I often wonder about that sort of thing, especially in the context of the panel that you sat on talking about healthy workplaces. Um, is there a time that you've run across someone maybe and you've spoken to them and there was something that they said or did that made you realize right away, it's like, oh boy, this person went through something and I don't know if they realize that they need to address it?
Sometimes, bringing it back to, like I said, the workplace, sometimes it may not even be something that's said by a supervisor or coworker. Sometimes it's the environment,
Mm,
right? Sometimes people are doing their absolute best to, be productive and thrive in an environment that's just not conducive to that. And so they realize, I'm working so hard, 9 to 5, get home and I'm drained. Or, I'm reaching for a drink, I'm, yelling at people and I'm just exhausted. And the thing about it, you're like, well, is it a supervisor? Is it a coworker? Like, what's making you feel like you need to do what you're doing? I have the best supervisor. I have the best coworkers. Everybody's so nice. Like, and then it's also, my coworkers also kind of dealing with the same thing. And then you realize it may not be the people, it may be the environment. And so that also changes the way that we address that, because at times we don't have control over the environment. We have control how we interact with it. And
mm,
so if it is a situation to where the environment may be, the catalyst for someone feeling, very drained, very exhausted, very frustrated, how do we change our approach to the environment? If it is a person, a supervisor, coworker, someone in totally different department that sent a very rude email, things like that, we're able to kind of hone in on more person to person interactions and communication skills and things like that. But sometimes it is important to also include the environment, and also check the environment, because sometimes the people are doing the absolute best that they can. Um, and so, you can't pinpoint, well, it's, this person or this
hmm.
supervisor, or, this interaction that really just, you know, sent me over. It could be the environment.
So I want to stick with that for a quick second,
Mhm.
because what occurred to me in your answer about what may be trauma inducing in that example is that it could be the physical space. I mean, it could be a workplace that's just not in a great location.
Yeah.
Um, but it also occurred to me that it could be someone who the commute, the commute just isn't good for them. It occurred to me also that it could be the kind of customers that they're dealing with in that workplace, or it could
Right.
be a number of different things. And so I think, what does this say though about the people who might say, you know what, why don't you just toughen up? There are people who don't even have a job. So you need to toughen up and take that drive that you don't like to drive for 40 minutes one way and 45 back.
Yeah.
So what? You don't like the place where you're working is falling apart. At least you have a job. Just shut up and take it and that sort of thing. Or someone who does work in an actual dangerous environment like law enforcement, or someone who has to go out and do work in the streets and that sort of thing. The people who are doing street repairs and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
What do you say to those types of people who say, this stuff isn't trauma inducing? You just need to toughen up. How do you respond to that?
That is such a good question. Um, Trauma is so different for every single person.
Hmm.
And if somebody is telling you, hey, my work environment is really taking it out of me, I just want to go home, go to sleep. Or, I this is too much. To be a supportive friend, supportive family member, spouse, things like that. Like, and to your point, you may be like, you got a job, you're fine. But that also diminishes their situation, because it's like, well, it's not just you, it's everybody. Well, but I'm telling you, this is my experience, and you're telling me that it's not important to you. Like, it's not important to you to understand what my experience is because you're saying everybody's going through it. I know everybody's going through it. It's one of those things where it's like, it could be very diminishing and very sometimes demoralizing to people, to where you're trying to share your experience and maybe vent a little bit or maybe even seek solutions, and the response is, well, everybody's going through that. Or you have a job and other people don't, and, that adds to that feeling of there's no place for me to just let it out. There's like not a lot of support and things like that. So if there's anybody out there who's like, oh, you have a job, to somebody who's, venting or trying to explain their situation, give them that space. Absolutely give them that space to vent and explain and share their feelings, because their trauma, like if that is a traumatic experience for them, it's a traumatic experience for them. Not everyone experiences trauma the same. People could go through the same experience, and one person may experience it as trauma, another person may not. And so it's very, like I said, diminishing to a person's experience if someone just kind of dismisses it and say, oh, everybody's going through that. Or, oh, yeah, I work there too, but I'm fine. I'm okay. And it's like, well, yeah, you're okay, but I'm not. And I'm trying to explain that to you. And you're not hearing me.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, that people experience trauma in different ways because once upon a time, and I'm saying this as a Generation Xer, with us when we were growing up, everything was tough it out, tough it out, tough
Hmm.
it out. And now a lot of us are in our 50s and 60s, and we're looking back and going, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, we toughed it out, but it took a really heavy toll over the course of a lifetime to go through a particular situation, and now you get to this point where you don't even want to tell people that was a really traumatic thing for me, because they're going, well, what's the matter with you? Why couldn't you take it? And that sort of thing. So I'm glad you said that people experience trauma differently. You're listening to The Way Forward. I'm Eddie Francis, and we're talking to DeJeune Green, and she is a mental training specialist, and we're talking about how people experience trauma and how they can bounce back from whatever traumatic event they've had in their lives. So in your experience, what do you find tends to be the most difficult part of people being able to manage whatever trauma they're going through.
Definitely. So with that, this is very specific to the individual. Sometimes someone may have issues with managing their trauma if they experience flashbacks, right? Those flashbacks sometimes take you straight back to that experience, the feeling, the experience itself. And sometimes, especially if it's your first flashback, or if you're having a flashback in the middle of work, or in the middle of something that you're enjoying, that flashback can take you to a place that you're actively trying to come out of. And so that could be something that can provide hardship for someone managing their trauma. But there are skills to help you come back and to ground yourself when experiencing a flashback. Another thing that could be difficult when managing trauma is the lack of resources, right? So let's say you are, maybe you could be in counseling or out of counseling, either way, if there's not, either a skill set that you can use when you do experience flashbacks, or you do experiencing, an overwhelming sense of, anxiety, or, just overwhelming emotions in general. And maybe you don't have a skill set to work your way through those. That could be a difficulty in managing trauma as well. And also support, right? Not having that support of someone who's going to listen. If you are having a bad day at work, and they're going to listen and not judge. I know that's like a thing now. We listen, we don't judge. But, having someone who actually does that, or not having, someone or people there to support you while you are navigating your trauma can be a difficult situation.
Mm. And one thing I want to lean on with you, and we didn't mention this at the beginning of the interview, but one of your specialties is working with athletes. And so I can imagine, I'm someone who has spoken to a few athletes, and on one of my podcasts, I interviewed someone who was a college running back, and we talked about what it was like for him to recover from a major injury. And I can only imagine, for example, with athletes who are injured, they go through a really tough time. It is really important for them to have a support system, right? I can only imagine that they've got to have those people around them who are telling them, you'll be back, or it's okay, or you are more than your sport, or that sort of thing. Does that tend to be a really tough thing for them to have a proper support system when they've experienced a traumatic event of an injury?
Sometimes, yes, because depending on the environment, you know, if your circle all have the same mindset of grind it out, get better, get back, then that's going to be the message. Grind it out, get better, get back. To where there may be, maybe the injury is career ending, and there's not space to grind it out, get back and get better. Who in that environment is going to say, this is it? This injury is going to keep you from, returning to your sport. Well, of course, I guess like medical professionals may let them know, but at the same time, who's there to go, so what are we going to do now?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so making sure that, you know, it could be a friend, a teammate, someone on staff who addresses mental health, an old neighbor, an old coach, having someone in your circle that's not going to be a yes man, yes woman, someone in your circle that's going to ask you those questions. Years in advance. It's like, all right, you've made it to college, and you're a D1 athlete. All right, cool. What's your major going to be? Like, what's your degree going to be in? Like, what's that plan? Or hey, you made it to a professional sport. Awesome. Like, what kind of continuing education things are going to use that the organization provides to maybe finish your degree from college? Or, what ventures are you interested in? Having those conversations, and not saying those conversations take away from the tremendous thing that they've done being a college athlete, being a professional athlete, but it's also saying you're more than that. to your point, you're more than an athlete. So how are you going to show the world that you have so much more to contribute, and what that looks like?
So let's think along those lines of getting support. What is the first step in recovery for someone who's experienced some sort of trauma in their lives? What's the first step for them to bounce back?
Uh, I would say being ready to do so,
Hmm.
right? Because sometimes people may not realize, this is, like I said, a pattern that's not good for me, or these are behaviors that I exhibit that aren't good for me and the people around me. Once that realization happens, and you could realize it and still not be ready to do something about it,
Hmm.
right? You could know, oh, I turn into such a mean person when, the slightest thing sets me off. And you're like, well, that's just the way I am. But then you kind of go, well, nope, nope, nope. That's just the way it's who I am. It's who I am. And then you could realize that, like, maybe that's not the best way to go about that. But there's another step in that is going, so what am I going to do about it? Some people
Hmm.
get there, some people don't. And I think that's the first step. And it's not really like a step or a phase that people go through, but I think that's kind of the first thing that people tend to do when they are looking to come back from trauma or manage their trauma is go, you know what I'm doing right now may not be beneficial to myself or to others. Part one. And then part two, I'm ready to do something about it.
Hmm.
When people get to part two of, I'm ready to do something about it, that could be something as simple as having a conversation with someone else. It may not be a direct link to counseling. It may be having an honest conversation with someone that they trust. You know, I realize I have been very, very mean, to you, to other people. And, I'm sorry, or, I'm sorry for that, or, that I probably should do better, or having a conversation like that. Um, Sometimes that's the first step. And another person may be like, counseling may help, and things like that. Or, the person who has this realization may be like, hey, I think I need to talk to a professional to work through this. Why am I so angry? I don't
Hmm.
have that reason, but, from what I understand, going to counseling can help me figure out why I'm doing this, and then also figure out how to change it up so I'm not being so mean to people
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to myself.
Yeah, and again, this really makes me think about the experience that I was going through before I decided I needed to go to counseling. And again,
Hmm.
it was drinking, it was eating, it was gaining weight, it was all kinds of stuff that was happening, and I knew that I was going through something, but I just
Hmm.
didn't. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was bothering me and what exactly I needed to do. And when I got to the point where I realized that I had gone through some pretty traumatic events,
Hmm.
and then I had someone to say, well, yeah, actually, you did go through traumatic events. They're way more traumatic than you realize. Then it all made a lot more sense to me. But I just remember being at that point, that pinpoint in my life when I was drinking, going to sleep, going to work, getting upset, losing my temper, having outbursts. And then at some point going, why am I doing this? And I just,
Hmm.
and it was the why am I doing this point that became the turning point for me to actually figure out what to do about it. In my case, very luckily, my support system started with my wife and her really talking me through a lot of things. So I'm wondering for people who are looking at friends or loved ones who they are saying this person is not themselves. They have gone through something. I don't know what it is. And I really want to help them and I want to help them get to the bottom of it. So for those people who want to be helpful, I always like to end my interviews by asking people what the way forward is. And so, what would be
Right.
the way forward for a friend or a loved one to help someone bounce back from a traumatic event?
Absolutely. And the bounce back can look so different. And sometimes it's not a complete bounce back. Sometimes it's
Mm,
it's a bounce, right? We're bouncing to a new way of thinking, a new, this is a new me, a different me, so it's not always a return to who you were. It's more so building to who you are now,
So it sounds
and
like
just
patience is very necessary here.
yes, yes. Patience. And then what we, talked about earlier as far as letting your loved one, your friend express themselves and not dismiss their story as, well, that happens to everyone. Or, you should have said something sooner, or you should have done this, or, why are you not, and putting that accusatory kind of blame on the person for finally being like, I just realized this is something that's going on with me. And now you're telling me, well, I should have done this and I should have done that. And why am I like this? And why am I like that? That, because this person has obviously thought about this a lot. And so for them to be able to come to you and be like, hey, here's what I'm going through, they don't need a judge and jury. They definitely need support. They need patience. But then also sometimes trauma can, you know, impact decision making, right? You know how
Mhm.
sometimes when people are going through some things, kind of the not a default, but a general response is, let me know what you need. Let me know what you need. And you may have the most genuine intention of, let me know what you need. Just call me. I got you. That person may be like, I don't know what I need right now. I don't know if I need, you know, dinner. I don't know if I need a vacation. I don't know if I need to just yell. I don't know what I need. So that person may not know how to respond to that, which again, good faith, good intention. Let me know what you need. I got you. A different way to approach that could be, hey, I'm making a pot of beans tomorrow. Want me to put you something to the side? I can do that and drop it off. Oh, person be like, well, I haven't cooked in a while. Yes, like please bring me some red beans. Like I really appreciate that. So, offering sometimes instead of asking can give that person the opportunity to make that decision that could have been harder than pick something. It's more so I'm doing this as like an offering. Do you want it? Yes or no. It's not giving them a million options. It's giving them three options.
Mhm.
And so that could be something that's helpful with someone who's, managing or working through their trauma. And then also really just letting them know that you're there and that they're not being a burden, because sometimes that's such a heavy feeling. Like, I know I always talk to you about, what's going on, and I'm sorry to keep on harping on it. If you have the space for it, it's okay. It's all right. But then also letting the person know, hey, I would love to talk about this with you, but I'm not able to do it right now. Maybe we can do this, tomorrow or a little bit later. So you're also protecting your peace a little bit, and you're able to support them if you know that you're not able to address this in the way that you need to. Being able to be like, listen, let's set up a coffee date. I want to hear all about it, but I'm not able to do it right now. So,
Mhm.
being honest with that person when you can support them, and then also when maybe you don't have the mental space or the emotional capacity to do it in that moment, but not just telling them, oh, I can't right now, or, you're talking about your issue again. No, no, you definitely want to be like, I want to hear it, but I'm just not able to do so right now.
DéJeuné, you're all right with me because you realize that red beans make everything better.
They really do. They
DéJeuné Green
really
is a
do.
mental training specialist. Thank you so much for joining me on the way forward.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.